Hello and welcome to Gaze Reading and this episode of Spill the Tea. I'm your host, Jason Blitman, and I am joined by Professor Dr. Nathan H. Lentz, and he and I spill the tea on sexual evolution. He is the author of the book, The Sexual Evolution, and we get into it, and I'm so excited for you to hear this episode. If you haven't listened to the other episode in the series, I talked to Elder Ratour, who is the VP and publisher of Penguin Classics, and we talk about what makes a classic a classic. You could find that wherever you get your podcasts or at gazereading.com. A few quick things before we dive in. If you are new to Gaze Reading, welcome. And if you've joined us before, welcome back. Always happy to have you. If you like what you're hearing, please share us with your friends, follow us on social media at Gaze Reading, and like and subscribe wherever you get your podcast so you'll be the first to know when a new episode drops. Also, I'm partnering with Aardvark Book Club to do an exclusive introductory discount where you can get your first book for $4 and free shipping. Just go to aardvarkbookclub.com, use the code GAZEREADING, and you can get your first order for $4. It's such a good deal. Highly recommend. I think that's all I got for you. I hope everyone is having a wonderful week. We'll be back with our regularly scheduled programming on Tuesday with an author with a new book coming out. But in the meantime, please enjoy the special Spill the Tea episode with Nathan H. Lentz. I'm thrilled to have you here on Gaze Reading today and talking about your book, The Sexual Evolution, How 500 Million Years of Sex, Gender, and Mating Shape Modern Relationships.
That's it.
I think that sort of sums it up. How did this book come to be?
Well, it's interesting that you asked that because we talk about it now very differently than we thought we would because of how much the world has changed since the book was finished last summer. But I'll tell you how the book came about is I've been teaching the biology of sex and gender for about 15 years. And two things really led to me wanting to write this book. One was that I teach my class as a seminar where we read a lot of papers, original research in the biology literature. So studies that are done on various animals and how they, have their reproductive behaviors and how they construct sex and gender. And I became increasingly annoyed with the way that scientists, biologists, my fellow biologists, discuss their own data, discuss their own observations. And my original drafts of the book actually was quite a bit more polemical, where I was taking a lot more umbrage with the way that scientists discuss sex and gender in animals. I toned that down quite a bit because my editor, I think wisely, was like, you need some allies. You can't just pick on everybody. You have to.
It's like when they say, when you have strong feelings, like write the email, but don't hit send.
Yeah, kind of like that. So
right.
we toned down a lot of the criticisms. But a lot of them made it in there, and a lot of them do come out when I give book talks, so you can hear more about those. But that was one side, and then the other side was, young people, especially young people, are really approaching these issues much differently than the older generation. So in just 2 generations, at least in the Western world, the approach to sex and gender has changed quite a bit. From people, from the approaches to when you get married, for example, and how you think about your own sexuality, whether or not it's fixed or fluid, and, different labels, pansexual, demisexual, none of these things, these labels anyway, existed not that long ago. And even things with gender and gender expression and gender identity is just radically different. And young people have had a kind of no labels, no rules approach to these things, including open relationships and polyamory and swinging and all this. And it freaks older people out. If you're over the age of 40 or 50, the young people are just kind of incomprehensible to you in terms of sex and gender. And so what I wanted to write a book that sort of explains this in a way that reminds everyone that this is not really anything new, actually, that other cultures, other times, other places around the world have done this differently, and creatively, more diversely, but other animals approach sex, gender, and sexual relationships in this much more expansive, broad, fluid sort of way. So what young people are doing now is a rediscovery of a much more expansive relationship with sexuality that we used to have, that humans used to have in other cultures, other times, and that our animal cousins enjoy today. And I use the word enjoy because I think it's a better way to live, actually, to have a much less restrictive approach to sex and gender.
Yeah. It's so interesting that you say that because it makes me think I was watching some TV show. I think it was Brooklyn Nine-Nine. Shout out to Brooklyn Nine-Nine.
Great show.
It's a great show.
Yeah.
And there was a comment made about how dogs' mouths are cleaner than humans. And like that obviously is a fallacy. It makes us
Mhm.
feel better about
Mhm.
having our dogs lick our faces,
Yeah.
right? And I think there's something too about the same thing about people or animals enjoying sex, right?
Mhm.
I feel like I was taught, it's like humans and dolphins are the two creatures that quote unquote enjoy sex or have sex for the sake of enjoyment. And of course, upon reading your book, I realized that is not true. And there's so many, it's so much more than that. And so it's interesting just to think like why we even tell ourselves these things in the first place.
Right. And I think, as I kind of hint at in the book, I mean, mostly our approach to this has been due to very recent social constructions
Yeah.
around sexuality. And I think that a lot of biologists looked out at the natural world and they squinted really hard to see sex the way that they think it should be in humans. So
Mm-hmm.
so it was much easier to sort of live with yourself in a consistent way if animals only have sex for procreation and they mate for life and they're all heterosexual and all that. That kept it simple. If that's
Well,
how animals do it, then that's why it's right for humans to do it that way and all of that. And of course, all of that's bullshit.
right.
It's all bullshit.
Right. Before we get into some more nitty gritty and specific things that interest me as gays reading, let's just say among the questions we want to answer today is what is sexual evolution?
Mhm. Well, so well, you mean the title or
Yeah,
the
yeah. I think
concept?
just like conceptually,
Yeah.
like if someone said, "What does sexual evolution mean?" I think obviously we can deduce and make our own assumptions. But to you, as you're embarking on writing this book, what does that mean? How do you define sexual evolution?
So to me, it's in recognition that sex has a long history.
Mm,
Humans did not just fall out of the sky, a few thousand years ago, right? Humans are the product of millions, hundreds of millions of years of evolution. And that is seen all throughout our body, all throughout our behavior. There's a long history to almost everything about us. Truly everything about us has a very long history. And sex is no different. So the way that we approach sex, the way that we approach gender, the way that we have sex with each other is the result of hundreds of millions of years of evolutionary tinkering and selection. And to me, to really truly understand sex as a behavior, forgetting about sexed bodies for a second, but just think about the behavior of sex.
hmm
You can't divorce it from its history. You have to really appreciate the long history of sexual creatures doing what sexual creatures do.
Yeah.
Because if you want to understand the politics of the United States, right, you have to understand its history. You cannot understand the current state of affairs without also looking backwards in time to see how we got here. And it's
Yeah.
the same sort of thing with biology. Evolution, you can't subtract evolution from anything about the human experience and
Mm.
expect to understand it all, because there's a lot of stuff that's weird and quirky about our biology. It really calls out for an explanation, and evolution usually provides that explanation, or at least tentatively provides that explanation. So
I
that's what I mean by it.
Yeah, no, I love that. Thank you for sharing that. I was in conversation, I don't know, a couple of years ago now with the author and historian Peter Frankopan
Hmm.
about his book The Earth Transformed. And
Hmm.
what's fascinating is he is a historian writing a book of, I mean, it was like a 800-page book that essentially was the history of the world. The
Hmm.
first chapter was called The Dawn of Time, and it really takes us to today. And part of what the book tries to unpack is that there's always been global warming. The earth has sort of always been in peril, and the earth will continue to spin after humans are long gone.
Hmm.
Right. And so it's very interesting, I think, that we as humans really latch on to the time and place that we are existing.
Right, as if it's always been this way. This is the right way. This is, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. It's
Yeah.
true. We are a very recent appearance on this planet, and we've transformed the planet tremendously since we've arrived. Almost always for the negative, for the worse. And I mean, humans have invaded every, landscape that they arrive in and totally transform it. Which, by the way, is kind of the conclusion I draw in the book. If you go all the way to the end of the book, well, wait a minute. Actually, no one's going to read the book
Right.
if I give away the punchline.
Don't give away
Never
the
mind.
ending. No.
Yeah, never mind.
That's why I shared what Peter Frankopan said in his book. Um,
You got to read. You got to read it.
Again, there are so many things I want to talk about, but I think that, a very hot topic, particularly in the queer community, is monogamy. And you do go on to sort of talk about, your chapter is fantastically called monogamish, which is one of my favorite words.
Mhm.
Can you talk about monogamy, social monogamy versus sexual monogamy, uh, and in whatever you feel appropriate? You don't need to like come out and
Yeah.
give me a whole lecture, although I would happily sit here and appreciate it, but I don't want to put you on the spot like that.
Right. Well, so monogamy is really, you have to understand the two sides of it. There's social or economic monogamy,
Yeah.
which is just the tendency to pair up. And lots of animals do this. Lots of animals pair up. By far, not all of them. But like, for example, birds are the kind of the stars of monogamy. They do tend to pair up. Whereas mammals, only about 15% of mammal species pair up. That's monogamy, the attachment that two individuals have, and you form a relationship that almost always involves sharing of resources, sharing of a homestead, living together, raising children together if there are children, that kind of thing. That relationship that takes priority over all other relationships. That's what monogamy is. It's an enduring. For birds, will often just do it for one season, but whatever. That long-term relationship, that's monogamy. And humans, it's not 100% universal, but pairing up is a human tendency. We tend to do this. We tend to pair up in these one-to-one relationships. Sexual monogamy or sexual fidelity is the exclusion of all other sexual partners in favor of the one that you are bonded with, right? So you would be, sexual monogamy is only even possible if you're already socially monogamous. But it turns out that social monogamy is pretty common, especially in birds. Sexual monogamy is almost unheard of in the natural world. It's very, very, very rare. And we only have appreciated that for a couple of decades, because when monogamy was studied in birds, for example, the tendency to pair up, including multiple seasons in some species, we assumed that it was sexually faithful. It was purely an assumption. It was not really true or tested. And when DNA testing was invented, so paternity testing essentially for birds, all of the ornithologists all around the world, one by one, started testing their species and kind of scratching their head going, oh my gosh, they are not sexually exclusive in these pairings. It's almost no birds are sexually exclusive. The females will accept extra pair copulations. The males will engage in extra pair copulations. And there's various reasons why they do that. And that's how I open the chapters, talk about what do they get out of it? Why would you want to? Why it's not count? Because people think it's counterproductive to the pair bond, but it's really not. And so no birds are really sexually faithful. Among mammals, it's a small minority that pair up anyway, right? So it's only about 15. Well, I'm sorry, it's 15% of primates are monogamous. Only about 8% in the whole mammal family. But of those primates, do you know how many species have found to be sexually faithful? 8. 8 species out of something like 6,000 mammal species out there. So it's a tiny, tiny minority. Sexual fidelity is just not a commonplace thing out in the animal world, including among creatures that pair bond. So when humans approach the issue of monogamy, I want to be clear that I'm not saying that if you choose to be sexually monogamous, that's unnatural and we shouldn't do that and we need to teach people differently. That's not at all what I'm saying. What I am saying, though, is we are peculiar for wanting sexual monogamy as a society, as a culture. We didn't used to have it in our culture that much anyway. And so it's not a biological imperative at all.
Yeah.
So we're not built for monogamy. Now, I don't think we're really built for anything else either in particular. I think we're very flexibly built when it comes to our sexuality. But the only big criticism or pushback that is a corollary of that is if anyone tries to tell you that open relationships are unnatural, well, that's just not true.
Sure.
because among the pair bonded species that are out there, they're almost all in what we would call open relationships.
And when, I don't know how familiar you are with the history of monogamy amongst humans, but how was that introduced?
Well, in different regions of the world, what we think of as like marriage kind of, and this is not my expertise either. I'm a
Yeah, that's right.
But the way I see it, the lens, I
Mm-hmm.
would say my conclusion of all the reading that I've done on this is that really the one-to-one relationships emerged after polygyny. So polygyny became the first kind of social control, where you
Mm-hmm.
had a single male dominating a small group of females, and that was what families looked like. So a single powerful male dominating a small group, and that was
Which,
the
which
in most
I want to interrupt just to say, per your book, I was shocked to see that that's how gorillas function.
yeah, many do, yeah,
Right.
in polygyny, yeah.
Yeah.
So you have a single dominant male that dominates over a small group of females,
Mm-hmm.
and just whether it's in humans or gorillas or lions or whatever, a lot of males, especially straight guys, think that sounds very attractive. What they're missing is that what it means is that most males don't get that, right? They die trying. And even if they're successful, they're always looking over their shoulder because the harem, the next male would love to depose that one male. So it's a very
Yeah.
despotic kind of hierarchical way that's actually not pleasant for anyone involved.
Huh.
Right. But the genes involved in the male being spread, to support that. So evolution doesn't always come up with fun solutions. But polygyny was sort of first, and then monogamy came essentially as a pushback against polygyny, by males, mostly by males, to try to have some form of equity. Then you get to marriage. So when civilization started to build on top of agriculture, then you started to have city states, and then you have eventually civilizations, which are just cultural steamrollers, right? So they just sort of mow down all of the microcultures all around and absorb, almost like a planet forming and collecting rocks, right? It's the same kind of thing, but with cultures. And once you have these big civilizations where it's Greece, Rome, Rome is what we're talking about in the West, you had to have a system for establishing inheritance. So you have
Mm.
powerful families with resources, and who gets them when the next generation, when people die and all this. So this invented the concept of legitimacy, like a legitimate heir. And so a man, a woman, a family, who gets the house in the next generation.
Hmm.
Interestingly, sexual fidelity, again, not implied in that.
Right.
So monogamy was called the Roman custom throughout most of Europe, and it kind of
Mhm.
spread really by force. But it didn't include, sexual faithfulness, at least not originally. That sort of came when the Christian church took over the Roman Empire.
Sure.
Their values started to then. So the Roman Empire had the tentacles, and then the church, got in that on the structure that was
Mhm.
already sort of existed politically, and then enforced Christian values onto the marriage structure
Oh,
and
that's
the
so interesting.
structure. Yeah, so it's very recent. Sexual
Yeah.
fidelity is a very recent idea, even in the West.
Well, and I think to simplify for me in my brain, the social versus sexual monogamy, learning about birds and sort of how it was it wasn't because they liked hanging out.
Mhm.
It was because they needed each other, right?
Mhm. Right,
One is sitting on the egg while the other one is out, getting food,
right.
and vice versa. And I love my husband, and I have no intention of breaking up with him, but I need my health insurance.
Mhm.
Right? So that's I think that's the version of sitting on the egg
That's
for
right,
me.
economic monogamy. It's
Yeah.
economic monogamy, and that's why birds are the masters of monogamy, is because
Mm,
their eggs require that constant incubation. So somebody has to be, in order to develop properly, the eggs really, somebody has to be sitting on them pretty much all the time.
right.
Whereas in mammals, the pregnancy is internal. So that's why mammals are not particularly prone to monogamy as a group.
Uh-huh.
Primates do it a little bit more than others, but it's just one way to solve that problem if you're a mammal. The problem of taking care of young and all of this, and family structures
Yeah.
in animals, I really do view them as vehicles for raising families. That doesn't mean that every member has to personally be involved in procreation, but the whole village is involved, right,
Hmm.
in raising the next generation. And so the people make a big deal about what's the comparison of the human family and other animals. I you have to be so careful in doing that because, they don't live like we live, right? And the social
Yeah.
forces are the key part of that. So,
You talk a bit about in the book and in some other conversations that you've had about taboos.
mhm,
And, it's interesting because taboos are taboos because they're not things that are out in the open, and they're
mhm,
sort of
mhm,
behind the closed doors, sex being one of those things. And I think sexual non-monogamy or
mhm,
sexual monogamishness
mhm,
is a part of that. And I'm curious, as you've said, things have changed even in the last few years. You
mhm,
were saying you were talking about things differently than when you were even writing the book.
mhm.
Can you share a little bit about what you've seen change in the short term and maybe what you could project in the long term?
Yeah, well, so in the short term, we definitely see. Are you talking about in humans? I
Oh,
assume.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
yeah. So young people now under the age of 30, we'll say,
Hmm.
much more likely to identify as queer, much more likely to be in open relationships or polyamory, or eschewing relationships altogether. And you've hear more and more of these terms like relationship anarchy, which are essentially kind of a absolutely no rules, no structure approach to relationships.
Yeah.
I think one thing that's I do want to say about it is that it doesn't escape the drama, right?
Oh,
The
no, no, of course
right
not.
people are like, oh, that is have people like this just solved the problem of jealousy? And I'm like, oh my gosh, no, definitely
No.
not.
And if someone has
Jealousy,
learned how to solve jealousy, please call me. I need to know.
yeah, and they won't because if you as I talked about in the chapter, other animals experience that, right? And it's not that conflict, the reproductive conflict, if you will, is not going anywhere.
Right.
But so these other kinds of relationships are not necessarily meant to, be one size fits all and we can, solve all of our problems. It's just another approach. And personally, I see pros and cons with all of them, and my opinion's always been, hey, work it out for yourself, you
Right.
and your partners, whatever your partner or partners, work it out, and honesty, transparency go a long way. And but if you think it's an escape from having a jealous partner, forget about that. I mean, it's in many ways it's a lot worse. But but you see this big difference among people under 30 and under 40.
Yeah.
And marriage rates, you're interesting though. So marriage rates are declining big time, and age of
Hmm.
first marriage is on the rise. However, divorce rates are also falling, and they've been falling
Hmm.
since the early 2000s, really since the late 90s. The rates of divorce are plummeting because people wait much longer and decide to get married after they've already done a lot of the things that cause relationship trouble
Mm.
early in your life, financial insecurity and professional, establishment, and prioritizing, family versus career versus, all of these things kind of get worked out in your 20s. And then people are starting to get married. So marriages are actually more stable than they had been
Hmm.
from the 1960s through the 90s. Marriages are more stable now. Partly of that is same-sex marriages tend to be more stable than opposite sex marriages, but that's working out too. I mean, we now have gay divorce. That we never had that
Right.
problem before, right? So that's a new problem we have.
Right. With gay marriage comes gay divorce.
Yeah, but gay marriages do tend to be more stable than opposite sex ones for the obvious reason that you're rarely forced into it by social pressure.
Yeah.
But anyway, I think it's interesting. People concentrate a lot about marriage rates declining, those who are reactionaries, but they're not celebrating the decline of divorce rates.
Mm.
Because to me, a divorce is much more of a disruption than just waiting to get married, right?
Yeah.
So I don't know,
And
whatever.
percentage wise, you would think they sort of balance each other out.
Somewhat. I mean,
Yeah.
right now we have now the majority of adults for the first time since they've had data are unmarried. That's never happened before. So the
Wow.
majority of it are either formerly married or not yet married. That's now only about half of US adults are in a marriage.
Hmm.
And that's very, upsetting and unsettling to some people because they think that that's the only way that humans should be, right? So, it's a failure of our society when this doesn't happen. So personally, I don't see the sky crumbling from something like that. But
Yeah. Right. Like that's complicated in its own way of like why that societal pressure comes into play.
Yeah.
And so the you don't have a crystal ball,
Mm-mm.
but in terms of trends,
Mm-hmm.
what does the future of monogamy, of sexual evolution, what does that look like to you? And I maybe I mean next year, maybe I mean in 20 years. And I think, just sort of, obviously none of this is fact or based in, anything specific, but based on your experience and your awareness, what would you say?
Yeah. So the trend I see is an increasing number of people approaching monogamy from an open or polyamorous kind of position. I think that
Mm,
that's pretty clearly on the rise. And we can project that out for a little while. These things tend to move in pendulums, but there's also progress to the pendulum, if that makes sense.
sure.
So you'll have like two
Two
steps
steps
forward, one
forward.
step back.
Right.
Yeah, you'll see some of that because there's some pushback.
Yeah.
Even among young people, they see, they'll have a bad experience and then they'll go fleeing back to maybe my parents were right, kind of a thing.
Oh
Um,
God.
it's interestingly though, whenever something goes wrong in a traditional relationship, no one questions whether the traditional relationship itself was the problem. But every
Mm,
time an open relationship goes wrong, people question, oh, well, that's why. What did you expect? Um, and that's a lot of pressure to carry
yeah.
on. and um, but speaking of pressure, I hope that one thing that will come out of this is an understanding that the society doesn't have to be structured any particular way for things to work out. You know what I mean? Like you don't have to have marriage as the dominant way that families are made. Monogamous, dyads, one to one. That the fact that people think that's the only way Western society could have worked out. That's remarkable to me that people think that when you
Yeah.
consider the diversity of relationships around the world, culturally and historically. So I hope that will come out of this as a more diverse approach to marriage and family life. Um, Whether or not non-monogamy becomes dominant over sexual monogamy, that I would be very hesitant to make any predictions on, because I
Hmm.
do think there will be, a maturing that goes on as we all kind of get used to this as something that goes on. The gay community is a good 20 years ahead of the straight community on most of these trends. And what you'll see is what I see anyway is a bit of a leveling off.
Mm,
A fair number of gay men, and I am particularly talking about men in this example, have explored sexual non-monogamy, open relationships, and you're starting to see people kind of retrench and go back in and say, "Well, that was fun for a couple of years, and a couple of bumps and bruises, and we're back into a closed marriage." Uh,
yeah.
for all the reasons I've talked about. They thought it was an escape from jealousy, thought it was an escape from some of this conflict, but it's just another variety of that conflict. There's also an additional social cost when you are against the grain, right? So that you do feel some of that pressure just by the fact that you are different than societal expectations. And that pressure comes home to roost, sometimes.
Mm,
So, with your family, with whatever, and your family might be fine with it, but then your partner's family isn't fine with it. So they try to destabilize your relationship because of that, because of their
right.
non-approval. I mean, maybe not on purpose, but they want something better for their son, for example, and so they try to, so you have whispers in your ear, which when relationships encounter difficulties, which they will, those voices in your ear become a little bit louder. So I think
Hmm.
that this will, like I said, there's a maturing and a leveling off that will happen, and then we can see sort of the natural prevalence of this.
Yeah. Something also, of course, that comes up in the book and in life in general and in this podcast all the time is the idea of binary
Mm-hmm.
and binary thinking, and it permeates, I think, every sort of conversation that we're having, including this one. And for me in particular, to speak to my own experience, when I heard the term open relationship, I assumed a door wide open, a free for all, a no rules, all fun, and for some reason, I just had these crazy expectations in my own mind because of society, or because of, I guess in my mind it was the opposite of monogamy, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so just I sort of want to say out loud, to say to you, to sort of talk in general about the idea of that it isn't that black and white. You know, I like to use the term and sometimes ajar instead of open,
Mm-hmm.
right? Just to sort of paint the picture that it it the door can be cracked. It
Yeah, right.
doesn't have to be a free for all, and you can within your partnership define it for yourself, which I
Mm-hmm.
think for me was a big unlock, just in terms of like, regardless of how you want to move forward, to be on the same page about what it means to you in a relationship is
Yeah,
really important.
I think it is. It can be a very empowering exercise to approach these things and decide it within a couple, how where the rules are, where the boundaries are, where the um where how you want to define essential relations, all these kinds of
Mm-hmm.
things. And one good thing that tends to come out of this is a lot of very open, honest, frank, vulnerable communication. And any marriage anywhere is going to be better off for having more open communication, more dialogue, more vulnerability. I can't imagine a marriage being worse off for having covered these
Talking too
things in
much.
detail. Yeah, exactly.
Right.
But I think so. I actually had a section of the introduction originally that was all kind of taken out during editing, where I talked about just some of the most common rules that people use in these open relationships. And some
Mm-hmm.
people have like well, only when you're out of town,
Mm-hmm.
or never in the home, or like in the marital bed, or I don't want to know, I don't want to hear about don't ask, don't tell. And then other people are like, no, full disclosure, I want names and faces. you know it's all over the place.
Right.
No,
Resumes,
yeah, no
credit
couple,
score. Right.
or only they play together. You see that a
Right.
lot too.
Right.
Like, we can play together, but not on our own. And there's good reasons why everyone, these are all potentially good rules.
Yeah.
What you do end up with, though, is a lot of these rules, boundaries, pitfalls is what those become,
Mm-hmm.
right? Because anytime you have a rule is an opportunity for rule breaking, right?
Yep.
So yeah, so you end up with this kind of this navigating. And what happens is a lot of times the people who aren't in the marriage but who are tangentially involved can feel very kind of depersonalized, dehumanized, as if
Mm-hmm.
they're now just a means to an end. Like, okay, I'm just sexual gratification for you. That's all that's allowed, or whatever. Or, oh well, if I had met you in another city, we could have sex, but because I live here, we can't. You know what I mean? And it makes the other
Yeah.
person feel very expendable and very. So it's one of these things where I think we're evolving into all of that too, and being
Mm-hmm.
being an extra person in somebody else's marriage, until you've done it yourself. There's some weird psychology that's involved that nothing has really prepared us for.
Yeah.
And that was the thing you mentioned, like when you heard open marriage, you had this expectation, because who were your role models for that? Who
Right.
sat you down and talked to you about any of these? Nobody, right? So
Right.
we're all having to invent this stuff for ourselves. So of course there's going to be hiccups. There's going to be fender benders along the way. That's normal. And as long as people just aren't too terrified of making mistakes, and
Yeah.
grace and forgiveness also go a long way, right?
You know, it's interesting just like thinking about role models and exposure in general. You know, my husband and I talk all the time about having a limited number of queer role models in a generation or two above us.
Hmm.
Certainly not, or it's uncommon that they might be married, or uncommon that they have children, or like there are a lot of non-common things or uncommon
Hmm.
things. Um, I have one comment and one question, but I in the last apartment building that we lived in, one of our neighbors, or a neighbor of ours, they were in a polyamorous relationship, and the couple that was living in the apartment, they were not the primary couple.
Hmm.
And so to know that like one person had their primary partner living in a different city, and a secondary partner was the one that they were sort of sharing their everyday life with, was a very new experience to see and to
That's
think
quite
about.
unusual. Yeah.
So unusual. I was like, well, and fascinating. And of course, like the more you think about polyamory, for me, I'm just like, oh, there's always someone to cook. There's always someone to clean. There's always, if you're not in the mood, there's someone in the mood. I was just like, oh, there are positives to having multiple people around. But from there, you talked about things that can lead to a social cost.
Hmm.
And being a neighbor to a polyamorous relationship at first was jarring simply because it was something I never experienced before. Your work is very specific, and so I'm asking this sort of as a person in the world who is very familiar with all of this. Do you, as a human, have advice for navigating the taboo, for breaking it down?
Yeah, well, so yeah, you have to learn. You have to
Yeah.
spend a little time doing homework is why I say, because you have to fill in some of these gaps that society didn't provide for you.
Right.
Some of this knowledge. So people who just march into an open situation, never having done it before, never having read much, whatever, they're destined to make errors and mistakes and things. So you want to communicate a lot before you even start your journey. Communicate a lot, and also learn from other people's experiences, and that way you can propose some hypothetical situations and talk them through. And then once you kind of feel comfortable, you've done some, and there are great books out there. Some of them are in the recommended reading of my book, but there's lots more. Just Google ethical non-monogamy, and you'll see lots of good things to read. I read Dan Savage's column for years,
Yeah.
and I of course listened to his podcast. So I think that's a good starting point to just see whatever other people are doing and talk it out with your partner. But then also don't get too rigid with yourself, with your partner, and allow some understanding, some grace, just because, you can do all this learning and then your first experience might change your mind about something, so be open to changing your mind, be open to taking a break and not being too, locked in on anything. And that doesn't necessarily lead to relationship anarchy, which is, the extreme in some cases. And I know a couple people who approach their relationships with this anarchy, no hierarchy, no primary, no secondary, and they have boyfriends, they have hookup buddies. They'll also just kind of things happen, all this, and they have all, and I'm always like, there's also friends with benefits, which are different than hookup buddies, right? All these different levels to it. And I'm just like, I talked to this guy for about 45 minutes and I needed a nap. Just to digest everything I'd heard.
Or like to take a look at the Google sheet or something.
Right. But their approach is like, no, we don't put anything in sheets. We don't keep track. It's all non-accounting. They're trying to get away from the accounting. And
that's fair. That's fair.
Yeah. I think that's fine in your 20s.
Right.
A little harder to pull off as you get older. Because stability, there's something to be said for stability, right?
Yeah.
But I often say, like, people are like, I've been accused of like, oh, you're trying to tear down monogamy and marriage and all this. I'm like, not at all. Not at all. I think if someone's happy with a very, restrictive, as I would put it, relationship, married, monogamous, heterosexual, whatever, and you're happy, no one's going to challenge you. You're fine. No, you don't need protection for your marriage. You're the default. No one cares. No one's going to try to convince you otherwise. And if they do, then they're just, they're evangelizing. But if you can accept that humans can approach these things differently, maybe you'll give your neighbor the same understanding that you expect in return. That's all I'm saying.
Totally. Well, and again, I am pro whatever anyone is choosing for themselves in the same way that you are. Though I say this all the time about vegetarianism. You're allowed to one day really crave a burger and eat a burger, and you're still a vegetarian. And that's okay that one day you had a burger. Life goes on, and so I not to evangelize anyone, but to someone who might be really digging their heels in on monogamy, might say, if one day you really want a burger, it's fair, right? Like, it's fair to want something extracurricular or whatever that means, because we're human, because we make mistakes, because we can break our social contract, because if there are rules, that means that rules can break,
and then hopefully it leads to a conversation,
right?
Because there are moments of, let's say, infidelity, of rule breaking, that can reveal deep cracks in something, and there's other moments that were just like, oh, I had a little too much to drink, and
sure,
and to contextualize that, for what it is and what it isn't. And here's the thing: I didn't know anybody who was non-monogamous growing up, but one thing I did find very strange was when you would see a lifelong marriage dissolve because of a single indiscretion.
Exactly.
Even as a kid, I knew that was wrong.
Yeah.
It's like, that's insane that you walk away from a whole life that you've built together because one person or the other made a mistake. And
Mm-hmm.
how many moments in your life have you been not at your best?
Right.
Right? Where no one is at their best all the time, right?
Right.
We all have low points. We all have rock bottom. We all have psychological challenges, and your needs get the better of you or whatever. Come on, like, can't
Right.
we? I've
No.
always known that was, and I will say that even morally wrong to walk away
Right.
from a marriage for a single indiscretion.
And that's sort of what I'm saying. Okay. We have to talk about the gay stuff. There's a lot of
Uh-huh.
gay stuff in the book too. Can you share again, I don't want to give too much away from the book, but one of my favorite takeaways was about the humpback whales.
Uh-huh.
Would you mind sharing a little bit about the humpback whales?
So, humpback whales had never been seen to have sex. They just hadn't been observed because they're fairly shy about it in the
Mm-hmm.
wild, and they won't mate much in captivity. And so people had never really directly observed humpbacks having sex. It finally happened in the fall of 2023. Two humpbacks were spotted copulating off the coast of Oahu, and it was two males having sex. And they are so baleen whales, the toothless whales, are known for their singing, right? You have blue whales and humpback whales, and they sing their songs for hours, and they travel distances. And we've again always assumed that the males were singing to the females, but all this time, males could have been singing to other males, and the singing could have been not just about attraction, but it could have been, scaring someone off. It could have been establishing territory. We're still figuring out what the hell these whale songs are really for.
Mm.
And I like that example because it's one of these things where animals have been having gay sex all this time, and we just didn't call it that. We didn't know, or we didn't call it that.
Sure.
And Bruce Begamel makes this point. He was like, you would have males humping each other with anal penetration and orgasm, but that was a dominant struggle. The scientists would not call that sex. That wasn't sex. That was a dominance struggle, a dominance competition. But then if a male just sniffed a female, that was a sexual interaction. You know what I mean? So, and that's part of what I've been reacting to in the book, is the way that scientists approach this. And why wouldn't we call two males having sex? I mean, if it's not procreative, well, then turns out that we gay people have never had sex. I guess I've never had sex. And so
Right.
It's like, of course
Perfect.
yeah, it's absolutely sex. It just, and that's why that's the lead up to the next chapter in the book, where I talk about the many purposes of sex. Sex does so many different things for a social species. It's not just about fertilizing the next generation. It performs a lot of important social functions. And when you think of it that way, and when you realize that it's that way, of course, two males and two females will have sex, because there's lots of other things that they get out of it. It's not just about procreation anyway. So why wouldn't they do it? In fact, it would be weird if they didn't. You'd be writing off half the population if you were strictly gay or strictly straight.
Yeah.
You would miss out on all these social opportunities. So,
and you go on to then talk about sexual diversity, and I'm curious, why do you think we fear sexual diversity, even though it's a feature of our species?
Social control. I think that social control gets so embedded and so taught, and the power of taboo is really strong. And the reason I say that so confidently is that there are lots and lots of other cultures that don't have any of these taboos, and it's not like they struggle with it and they have to teach. They don't have to unteach these taboos. If you don't put these taboos there in the first place, they won't form, right? And so there's lots of cultures that, and by the way, they're not all great. Right. It's not all positive. Right. There are cultures out there that don't really respect consent or age of consent. So I'm not saying, hey, it's all fine. I'm just saying that there isn't a biological imperative. That's all I'm saying on a lot of these things, and that we can take it or leave it on a lot of these different things. But I do think it does come down to social control. But there's one taboo that does seem almost universal, and that is, as you mentioned, we have sex in private.
Yeah.
And that's not, animals don't do that, right? They don't go off and secretly.
We do a lot of things in private.
And that's one thing that there's something interesting there to explore. And I don't know what it is. But there's, I'm sure it has to do with a little bit with paternity certainty and that kind of thing, and obscuring that, whatever. But, and we lived in very tight-knit, small social groups. We evolved that way for hundreds of thousands of years, very small groups, 150 or members or less. You knew everyone there. And so it's conceivable that sex in private was also a way for you to reclaim autonomy. That way you were in control of what other people knew about your sexual life.
I mean, and that's true with clothing.
Mm-hmm. Clothing's also very human peculiar, right?
Yeah. Well, and it's like, it's an element of privacy. We are keeping pieces of our body that we don't want to share with other people private.
Mm-hmm. And you could think about the reasons why that would be socially beneficial. So I think that's kind of nudity and sex in private, I think, are part of that same coin. Yeah.
Yeah. But it's so interesting because, like, if we were to get naked, sort of literally and metaphorically, if we got rid of our clothing, if we were more open with our thoughts, feelings, desires, hopes, dreams, whatever, it would sort of break down all of that socially. So it's really like, it's the glue that's it's this weird chicken egg, the thing that's keeping society together.
Yeah, I think in general that the modesty, the secrecy, that all that is is it a net positive or is it a net negative? I don't know. I think it opens up opportunities for coercion and manipulation. Definitely has a dark side to all of it. But at the same time, it's also nice to have. I really like my privacy.
Sure.
It's something that's an important value to me. I'm fairly private with a lot of things I do. So, I don't know if it's a net positive or net negative. That's really for sociologists, I guess, to explore.
Totally. Well, yeah. Well, and it's just an interesting thing for us as humans to think about, because this is sort of how we're going about our daily lives.
Yeah, exactly. We're steeped in it.
Right.
And, and people have talked about, like, for example, sex differences when it comes to behavior. And if you notice, I don't talk about sex differences when it comes to behavior. I do a little bit when it comes to biology, but not behavior, because we still to this day have no idea how much culture imprints gender in a way that's not biological. You know what I mean? Like, no one's been raised free of gendered culture. So we really have no idea how men and women might behave differently if they weren't imprinted on this. We are told to do and want different things even before we're born, right? Newborns are described differently by even the most progressive parents based on whether they're male or female.
Yeah.
If it's a male, they'll say they're strong and robust and tough and big, and there's no biological differences between little boys and little girls at infancy, right? There's not size difference, strength difference, none of that stuff.
Right.
But the women, the little girls are delicate and cute, and the boys are robust and strong. And so when you think about that imprinting starts literally on the first day of life. We have no idea how different men and women would be free from that. So apply that same logic onto relationships, onto being queer, onto marriage. When the taboos associated with that are so deeply embedded that we don't know what we would be like free of that.
Right. There are so many great chapters. There's great chapter about gender and sex. There's a great chapter about the gay gene. I'm so excited for folks to check that out. I'm curious, before I let you go, is there anything in the process of you writing this book that surprised you or that you discovered?
Yeah, I would say the most surprising thing is basically everything that's in chapter 2, which is gender and animals.
Yeah.
So I believe that the same thing prior to about 15 years ago, the same thing that biologists are teaching, all over the world, is that there's male behavior and female behavior, and animals behave in male typical ways and female typical ways, and that's all there is to it. I was totally unprepared before I did the research for this on how much diversity there is within the sexes in animals. There are different ways to be a male. Whether you're a sunfish or a cricket or a gorilla, there's not just one kind of male. There's male diversity and there's female diversity. And these are real biological differences. It's not just like a strategy that you can pick and choose from. And today you'll try this and tomorrow you'll try that. Or when you get bigger, you'll try something else. There are different flavors of maleness, different flavors of femaleness in the animal world.
Yeah.
And when I was teaching this class, I was telling you about sex and gender, and we kept encountering examples of gender diversity right there in the papers that we're reading. And the scientists themselves missed it. Like they just ignored it. There was this one on bluegill sunfish that talked about, there's these, they called them cuckold males. But then if you look at, and they kind of discarded them because they didn't build nests. They didn't attract females. They didn't do what we expect male sunfish to do. But 40% of the offspring were fathered by those other males. 40%. That's not small. Like that's a significant part of the social life of bluegill sunfish is to be a different kind of male. You can't just dismiss 40% of the males as being suboptimal, whatever. They have a different strategy, a strategy that's clearly successful.
Right.
So that was the most surprising thing to me was gender diversity in animals. I wasn't expecting to see that.
That's so cool. What a fun thing for you to learn.
Yeah.
Dr. Nathan H. Lentz, thank you for being here.
My pleasure.
Sexual evolution. I to the listeners, I hope this conversation helped break a little bit of those taboos, enlightened you a tiny bit, and the book I know will do the same. So I'm so excited for you to check it out, and thank you again for being here.
Thank you for having me. This is a wonderful conversation, and I'll be subscribing to your podcast. Don't worry.